He had everything money could buy. A private jet. A penthouse that touched the clouds. A closet full of watches worth more than most people's houses. And he had never once in 32 years heard a woman say, "I love you," and meant it. That night, standing in the doorway of his own apartment, he watched a woman he'd been seeing for 3 months slide a diamond bracelet onto her wrist without even looking up to ask if his flight home had been rough. She hadn't asked about his day. She hadn't asked about him at all. She'd only asked one thing since he walked through that door: "Is that box for me?" He stood there for a long moment, just watching her admire herself in the mirror, turning her wrist this way and that so the diamonds caught the light. And something inside him finally broke. "What exactly do you love about me?" he asked quietly. She didn't even hesitate. "I love the beautiful life you give me." He nodded slowly, like a man who'd just had his last doubt confirmed. "I think you should leave." She left without an argument. Of course she did. There was always another billionaire around the corner. Alone in that enormous, silent apartment, surrounded by everything he owned and nobody who actually wanted him, he made a decision that would change his life, and the lives of a poor farmer and his daughter 300 miles away, forever. His name was Nonso, and he was about to disappear. By morning he'd made up his mind. If every woman who ever smiled at him was really smiling at his bank account, then he needed to find out what it felt like to be loved with an empty one. He would leave the city. He would leave his name, his face, his fortune, all of it, behind. He would become someone with nothing to offer but himself. He called his mother first, then his father, and asked them both to come home immediately. When they arrived, breathless and worried, expecting some kind of emergency, what they got instead was their only son announcing that he intended to vanish into some rural village, dressed as a disabled beggar, to test whether anyone could ever love him without knowing who he really was. His father, a powerful, ambitious politician, nearly came out of his chair. "You are a billionaire," he said, as if Nonso might have somehow forgotten. "I am a politician. Your mother is one of the most recognized businesswomen in this country. If anyone discovers who you actually are, you could be kidnapped. You could be killed." His mother's voice cracked. "Nothing is worth losing you." But Nonso had already decided. If he told them exactly where he was going, they would send guards, drivers, people to quietly hover in the background, and the test would mean nothing. So he told them only that he was going far enough that no one would recognize his face, and he asked them to trust him. His father, defeated but unwilling to lose his son to silence, gave him one final warning before he walked out the door: "Do not become careless simply because you believe nobody recognizes you." Nonso promised he'd be careful. Then he traded his tailored suits for worn, dusty clothes, folded his 6-foot frame into a wheelchair he barely knew how to steer, and left behind every comfort he'd ever known. He had no idea that 300 miles away, a young woman named Irinma was about to change everything. The first few days on the road were the hardest thing he'd ever done. He'd flown to 5 continents but never once walked, or rather wheeled himself, down a dirt road with an empty stomach. He'd shaken hands with presidents but never once held out an open palm to a stranger and asked for help. Nothing in his life had prepared him for what it felt like to be invisible. People walked past him like he wasn't there. Some looked away entirely as if his presence embarrassed them. For a man who was used to rooms going silent the moment he entered them, this new kind of silence, the silence of being unseen, cut deeper than he expected. Then, on a dusty road just outside a small village, a young woman stopped. She was carrying baskets of vegetables to market, her father's morning harvest balanced against her hip, and something about the tired, hungry man in the wheelchair made her pause. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm just trying to get by," he said, and for the first time since he'd left the city, it was the truest sentence he'd spoken. She dug into what little money she had and pressed it into his hand. "I know it's not much," she said, "but it's all I have right now." He looked down at the crumpled bills, worth less than the tip he usually left at breakfast, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Gratitude that wasn't performance. Kindness that expected nothing back. "Thank you," he managed. "You don't know how much this means to me." Her name was Irinma. When she found out he had nowhere to stay that night, guilt tugged at her all the way home. She lived with her father in a small house on a small farm, and she wasn't sure he'd agree to take in a stranger. But when she told her father what she'd seen, a young man alone, hungry, with no place to sleep, the old farmer didn't hesitate for even a second. "No one should be left to suffer when we have a roof over our heads," he said. "Go back and bring him here." And that was how a billionaire who owned 3 houses ended up sleeping for the first time in his life, in a home with dirt floors and a leaking roof, and feeling for the first time in his life completely at peace. The weeks that followed felt like something out of another lifetime. Irinma's father built him a shaded resting spot beneath the biggest tree on the property, because everyone needs a quiet place to breathe. Irinma taught him a village game with stones and pebbles, laughing every time he lost, refusing to believe he'd never played it before. In the evenings, the three of them sat together and talked about nothing important: the weather, the harvest, silly village gossip, and Nanso realized these were the first real conversations he'd had in years that weren't about deals, contracts, or appearances. But guilt followed him like a shadow. Every kind word from Irinma, every plate of food her father insisted he take a second helping of, every gentle "you're welcome here," landed like a small blade. He was living inside their generosity under a lie, and the longer it went on, the heavier that lie became. Back in the city, his parents lit candles and prayed for a son who wouldn't tell them where he'd gone. His mother told herself he was simply taking time away the way he always did when the world got to be too much. But every night she asked God to keep him safe wherever he was. Meanwhile, in the village, Irinma finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been sitting between them for weeks. "You've never told us how you ended up in that wheelchair," she said one evening. "What happened to you?" Nanso had rehearsed this lie 100 times, but saying it out loud to her face was harder than he expected. "A car accident," he said. "A few months ago. My legs were badly hurt. The doctors say surgery could fix it, but I could never afford it." Irinma didn't say anything for a long moment. She just looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen directed at him in years. Not pity, not calculation, just pure, uncomplicated sympathy. That look was the moment her father quietly decided he was going to help this young man walk again, whatever it cost him. What Nanso didn't know, because he was too deep inside his own guilt to notice, was that Irinma and her father had started selling more at the market, working longer hours, setting aside every extra coin. When that still wasn't enough, the old farmer made a decision he never told his daughter about until it was already done. He sold a piece of the only land his family had ever owned, land that had carried his father's name and his grandfather's name before that. He handed Nanso an envelope stuffed with cash and told him, simply, "The money for your surgery is ready." Nanso stared at the money in his hands and felt the full, crushing weight of what he'd built. This wasn't a diamond bracelet accepted without a second glance. This was a man's inheritance, sold to help a stranger he believed was suffering. He couldn't take it. He couldn't let the lie go one more day. "I have to tell you something," he said, his voice shaking for the first time since he'd arrived. "I'm not really a beggar. I'm not poor. I'm a billionaire. The accident, the surgery, all of it, none of it was real. I came here because I wanted to know if anyone could ever love me without knowing about my money." The silence that followed was the loneliest sound he'd ever heard. Irinma's father didn't yell. He simply looked like a man who'd had the ground pulled out from under him, because he had. "That land carried my father's name," he said quietly, "and his father's before him. I sold it for a lie." Irinma's reaction was worse because it wasn't anger, it was heartbreak. "We fed you when we barely had enough ourselves," she said. "We gave you a room. We worked every single day because we believed you needed us. And you let us." Her voice broke on the last word. "I had started to believe we could have a future. I think I was falling in love with you. Now all I can see is betrayal." Nanso left that house with nothing but the truth trailing behind him, and for the first time since he'd arrived in the village, he understood exactly what it felt like to lose something money could never buy back. Word of a billionaire beggar spread through the village faster than any harvest ever had. A local man named Emeka, who'd spent months pursuing Irinma with fake wealth borrowed from a job he'd been stealing from, saw an opening and rushed to her doorstep, offering to forget everything that happened and start fresh. Irinma turned him away without a second thought. She'd already seen exactly what kind of man he was long before any of this began. Her friend Amaka, meanwhile, revealed a jealousy she'd been hiding for years. She went straight to Nanso, telling him lies about Irinma flirting with other men, hoping heartbreak would push him into her own arms instead. When Nanso saw through her instantly and asked why she'd waited until now to say anything if her feelings were real, she had no answer, because there wasn't one. He threw her out, calling her exactly what she was. But none of it mattered. Nanso didn't want Amaka. He didn't want anyone but the woman he'd hurt, and the old man whose trust he'd broken beyond repair, or so he feared. He went home to the city carrying more regret than he'd ever felt in his life. His mother listened to the whole story and told him gently that maybe it was for the best. His father's reaction was colder. "Good," the old politician said. "I'm glad she rejected you. I never supported this foolishness in the first place. You have one job now, marry Chief Okafor's daughter. That marriage secures my governorship. Forget the village girl. For the first time in his life, Nonso looked his father in the eye and said no. This is not about love, his father snapped. This is about power, about this family's future. Then I don't want it, Nonso said. My heart is with Irinma. He turned around and drove 300 miles back to the one place where, despite everything, he still believed love might be real. When Irinma saw him standing in her doorway again, she felt something crack open in her chest, relief and anger tangled together. I thought you were gone forever, she whispered. I tried to stay away, he admitted. Every road in my heart brought me back to you. She told him her father had ordered him to marry another woman for political gain, and that he'd refused. That single sentence undid weeks of hurt. If we try again, she said finally, there must be no more lies. Never again, he promised, and this time he meant it. But peace never comes easy in a story like this one. Nonso's father, unwilling to accept defeat, hatched a new plan. Invite Irinma and her father to the city under the guise of generosity, buy them a house, arrange a business for the old farmer, and then quietly threaten them into disappearing from Nonso's life forever. He sent men to deliver the warning himself, stay away from my son, or you and your father will vanish and no one will ever ask why. When Irinma told Nonso what his own father had done, something in him finally snapped. He confronted his father directly, then walked straight into Chief Okafor's home and rejected the arranged marriage to his face, announcing in front of everyone that Irinma was already carrying his child and that he would never marry anyone else. The consequences came fast. Chief Okafor withdrew his support, and Nonso's father lost the governorship in the very next election. Humiliated and desperate, the older man made one final terrible decision. He sent men to attack Irinma's father, hoping fear alone would finally break his son's resolve. It nearly cost the old farmer his life. Nonso found his father that night and for the only time in his life, pointed a gun at the man who raised him. If Irinma's father dies, he said, voice shaking with a fury 30 years in the making, you will pay for it with your own life. His father broke down completely, the first honest moment between them in years. I pushed you too far, he admitted. My greed brought us here. I only ever wanted you to have the life I thought was best. I understand now. I won't let you down again. It would take a long time to know whether that promise was real. But slowly, painfully it was kept. Irinma's father survived. Nonso's father stepped back from ruthless politics entirely and for the first time, put his family first. As for the people who tried to tear Nonso and Irinma apart, life had its own way of settling accounts. Emeka was caught stealing from his employer and arrested. Amaka, who'd married a stranger claiming to be wealthy just despite the life Irinma had chosen, discovered too late that he was poor and dishonest, and found herself pregnant, abandoned, and alone. When she crossed paths with Irinma again, expecting judgment, she received something she never gave in return: help without conditions. It's never right to look down on others, Irinma told Nonso that night. Life can change in ways we never expect. Years later, Nonso stood in front of a building he'd spent a fortune constructing. Not a tower with his name in gold letters, but a foundation that offered real surgeries to people who actually needed them, real shelter to people who actually had nowhere to sleep, real second chances to people the world had learned to walk past. For a long time, he told the crowd gathered for its opening, I believed money was the only thing people ever cared about. I disguised myself as a beggar to test that theory and I found something I never expected. A family who had nothing and gave me everything anyway. They taught me that real wealth isn't what sits in a bank account. It's the compassion you carry in your heart. Somewhere in that crowd, Irinma watched the man she'd once turned away take his father-in-law's hand and help him take a slow, steady step forward. Because after years of surgeries funded by that very foundation, the old farmer was finally walking on his own again too. Money had built Nonso's empire. But it was a poor farmer's kindness and his daughter's stubborn, unshakable heart that finally taught him what it meant to be rich. If this story moved you, you know what to do. Hit that like button, drop a comment and tell us which moment hit you hardest and subscribe so you never miss the next one. Thanks for watching and stay blessed.